So far, 1963 was a busy year for the Beatles, to say the least. They started off in February on their first UK-wide tour as a support act for Helen Shapiro, then supported American artists Tommy Rowe and Chris Montez on tour through most of March, followed by being the support act for Roy Orbison through May into June, which led on to them being top of the bill on their own summer season at Britain's seaside resorts. This unrelenting touring schedule, coupled with regular airplay of the single She Loves You, would naturally lead to their first UK-wide tour as headliners. The infrastructure for the tour comprised of the Beat Boom cinema theatre chains such as ABC, Odeon, Granada and Gaumont, the last two cinema chains being owned by Sidney Bernstein and his brother Cecil, of which there were 60 cinema theatres in total. Oh, I nearly forgot. We got a new Conservative Prime Minister after Harold Supermac Macmillan resigned. His name was Alexander Frederick Douglas-Home, Baron Hume of Kersal. He was called Lord Douglas between 1918 and 1951, and the Earl of Hume from 1951 until 1963. On the 23rd of October 1963, 4 days after becoming Prime Minister, Hume disclaimed his earldom and associated lesser peerages, and was known after stepping down from the Lords as Sir Douglas-Home. That was jolly decent of him to give up all those titles, especially given his privileged upbringing. From the first day of the Beatles' headlining autumn tour, the term Beatlemania continued to hit the headlines in the press. Those it was attributed to included the Daily Mirror's music journalist Don Short, and the word appeared in the 2nd of November edition, when the headline screamed Beatlemania and noted it's happening everywhere, even in sedate Cheltenham. The article was certainly notable for its insistence proclaiming everyone, everywhere is catching it, and it ended with a provocative detail. Programmes were thrown on the stage, with telephone numbers written on them in lipstick. The Daily Telegraph responded to the recent outbreak of Beatlemania with a leader column comparing the rampant hysteria of the Beatles with Hitler's Nuremberg rallies when the Beatles played at Sheffield City Hall on November the 2nd. 2 days later, the Beatles were performing in front of England's own Germanic elite in the guise of Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother at the Royal Variety Performance. There isn't a show in the history of show business, nor in the history of television, that compares to the Royal Variety Performance. The very best in entertainment from around the globe has been presented year after year since the first show in 1912, consisting of family entertainment that includes comedy, music, dance, magic, and other specialty acts. By the time impresario Bernard Delfont, that's Lou Grade's brother, remember, had booked the Beatles for the Royal Show, the Fab Four were already big stars. ITV had been chosen to broadcast the show and recorded their most viewed show of all time when it was broadcast by ITV a week later, on the 10th of November 1963, to 21.2 million people, which would have made the Grade brothers very happy. The group achieved their 4th British #1 single in 1963 with I Wanna Hold Your Hand, days after the Royal Variety Show performance broadcast. Of course, similar to Val Parnell's Sunday night at the London Palladium, the Royal Variety Performance was a firm favourite with the British public, both being televised at prime time on Sunday evenings. Being massive Beatles fans, my family watched the show. My father in particular loved John's scripted ad-lib about the rich rattling their jewellery instead of clapping. Yet despite Lennon's minor dig at the upper classes, the Royal Variety demonstrated to the public that the Beatles had royal approval, which means establishment approval. And if they played for Princess Margaret and the Queen Mum, then they're good enough for the rest of us, long hair or not. Bob Geldof's sisters took him to see his favourite acts at Dublin's Adelphi Theatre. Geldof has admitted that he associates the Beatles with the smell of urine. The singer revealed that he was stunned by the large number of girls peeing themselves at a Beatles concert and can no longer remember the band without thinking of the incident. The Beatles was a case of watching females in excelsis. It's the old cliche, but you couldn't hear them for all the screaming, he told Q magazine. I remember looking down at the cinema floor and seeing all these rivulets of pee in the aisles. The girls were literally peeing themselves with excitement. So what I associated most with the Beatles is the girls' urine. The concert scared me, Bob admits, aged 12 at the time. All that screaming, all that abandoned femininity. Back from Ireland, the Beatles carried on with their autumn tour, and Dora Bryan was asked to record a Christmas song. She rewrote some of it, probably the words, and recorded it the next day. It was played on the radio constantly, and when she appeared on Top of the Pops, she said proudly, it was voted the best bad record of 1963. Yet the Beatles liked the song and recorded part of it in one of their Christmas fan club messages. Of course, the pop press were cashing in on both the Beatles and Christmas editions. On the 18th of November 1963, just before midday, the newly excavated tunnel beneath the Thames at Dartford was opened. The tunnel had been in planning since the 1920s. And just as work was finally underway, the diggers had to down tools when war broke out. There had been queues of motorists wanting to be among the first through. Most of the early traffic were sightseers. That may seem odd today. For its time, the tunnel was actually a state-of-the-art design, so perhaps wanting to be among the first through it wasn't so odd. On the same day the Dartford tunnel was opened, the Beatles attended EMI House London to receive silver discs for Please Please Me and the not yet released With the Beatles from EMI chairman Sir Joseph Lockwood. They also received silver EPs for Twist and Shout from George Martin and a silver EP and single for Twist and Shout, and unsurprisingly for She Loves You from Gerald Marks, the editor of Disc. But let's face it, She Loves You had been played to death, and unbelievably, people were still buying that inane song. There was a lot happening on both sides of the Atlantic on the 22nd of November. First and most important of all to me back then was the release of the Beatles' second UK long player, With the Beatles. This was recorded onto reel-to-reel tape recorder as soon as my dad could borrow a copy, and of course was played continuously thereafter. The release of With the Beatles coincided with the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy. There is this now cliched question: where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? Well, I can tell you where I was when the moon landings allegedly took place and when the Twin Towers fell, but I can't tell you where I was when Kennedy was shot. The Beatles, however, were at the Globe Theatre, Stockport, on the same day Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and it was reported that John Lennon, on hearing the news, asked if the show, which was a date on their autumn tour, should still go ahead. Overshadowed by Kennedy's assassination were the deaths of British writers C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley. Like many other children, C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, had a massive influence on me in primary school, especially the part when Aslan's sacrifice undoes the deep magic and cracks the stone table. That set a few cogs turning in my young mind. Aldous Huxley's dystopian future in his book Brave New World set a few cog turnings much later. Some would say that his Brave New World and Orwell's 1984 are the literary bookends that represent our near dystopian future world. I rather hope not. Talking of dystopian worlds, an unearthly child the first series of Doctor Who, was broadcast on BBC TV in 4 weekly parts from the 23rd of November to the 14th of December 1963. The show's launch was overshadowed by the assassination of John F. Kennedy the previous day, resulting in a repeat of the first episode the following week. The show was created to fill a gap between children's and young adult programming. I don't mind admitting that I watched the earlier episodes from a position of safety behind the sofa, especially when the Daleks first came on screen, who are the mechanical extraterrestrial race of extremely xenophobic mutants who prompted kids who watched the show to walk around with an arm outstretched chanting, "I am a Dalek," for weeks to come. Sadly, also on the 23rd of November, police in Ashton-under-Lyne, Lancashire, began a missing persons investigation following the disappearance of 12-year-old John McBride. He is the second victim of the Moors murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Evil still lurked in what was supposed to be innocent times. Meanwhile, the Beatles continued with their headlining autumn tour. The backgrounds of the support acts makes interesting reading. A young Jimmy Page played lead guitar on the Brooks Brothers' Trouble Is My Middle Name single, and did some of his best session work for them when they recorded under the name of the Brooks for the Decca label in 1964. The Vernon's Girls were session singers for Decca, and provided the female backing vocals on many UK hit singles during the 1960s, one of the first being Billy Fury's Maybe Tomorrow. In the US, the group charted with the first Beatles tribute album there, We Loved the Beatles. Vicky Haseman formed the Breakaways and married Joe Brown. Their daughter Sam Brown is a well-known singer in her own right. As a rock and roll singer and guitarist, Joe Brown has performed for more than 6 decades, and after he sang Joe Brown's big hit Picture of You on the Beatles' first radio broadcast, the two became close friends right up until George's death in 2001. Joyce Baker married Marty Wilde. Marty Wilde was among the first generation of British pop stars to emulate American rock and roll. Joyce and Marty formed a trio with Justin Hayward, later the Moody Blues frontman, called the Wild Three, and were the parents of singers Ricky Wilde, Roxanne Wilde, and We're the Kids in America, Kim Wilde. Lynn Cornell married session drummer Andy White, notable for replacing Ringo Starr on the early take of Love Me Do. Both Joe Brown and Marty Wilde were managed by Larry Parnes. Parnes decided against managing the Beatles. He was the one who developed the idea of the package tour, for which his stars toured the country together in a bus, playing one-night stands around the country. On the 27th of November, the Beatles were back on Sidney Bernstein's Granada TV. Remember him? He was Lou Gray's rival. They recorded an interview with fellow Scouser and comedian Ken Dodd. And at last they promoted their new single, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Much to my dismay, I Wanna Hold Your Hand was held off the #1 spot by, you guessed it, She Loves You. Surely after months of hearing the song you'd have thought people would have been sick of hearing it, let alone continue to buy the single. The month of November concludes with the Beatles' second album, With the Beatles, knocking off their debut album Please Please Me from the #1 spot in the album charts. But the year that made the Beatles isn't over yet.